I understand the Honourable Member for New Brunswick South West is rising to respond to the point of privilege.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to respond to the supposed question of privilege from the Honourable Member for Mont-Royal, which was raised on November 16th and 23rd, along with the submissions made by the Honourable Member for Windsor-Tecumseh. I appreciate that you have allowed. I appreciate the time you've allowed to return with a response. For the reasons I will put before you, I believe you will find that there is no basis to conclude a prima facie breach of privilege has taken place. Monsieur le Président, la question en jeu est liée à l'identification des électeurs par le Parti conservateur du Canada dans la circonscription électorale de Mont-Royal. Comme vous le savez, Monsieur le Président, chacun des partis politiques à la Chambre des communes identifie ses électeurs d'une façon ou d'une autre. C'est un élément important du processus politique, le fait de communiquer avec les Canadiens, de discuter avec eux des enjeux et de leur demander s'ils soutiennent notre parti n'a rien de nouveau. En définitive, les ressources utilisées pour faire ces appels n'étaient pas celles du Parlement ou du gouvernement du Canada, mais bien celles du Parti conservateur. To be clear, in no way was any parliamentary resource or time used to conduct a routine political activity. Mr. Speaker, we are aware of numerous circumstances where the Liberal Party of Canada was, prior to the last election, making voter identification calls in various ridings across the country, targeted seats held by Conservative members of Parliament. I will also add that, at that point, the election timing was entirely speculative, there not being an election called or scheduled until after all the opposition parties joined together and voted on March 25th for an unnecessary early election. Did those calls impinge on the work of the sitting members? Did those calls prevent the MPs from doing their job? No, absolutely not. This is exactly what a political party is supposed to be doing, targeting ridings they believe that can eventually be won.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member for Mont-Royal indicates that his ability to do his job as a representative of the riding because of these calls has been undermined. This is simply not the case. As the Honourable Member noted, he has many bills and motions on the order paper and notice paper. Moreover, I am told, he has been very active in recent meetings of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Clearly, his work in this place has not been impeded in this regard. Moreover, members have numerous tools provided by taxpayers to communicate with constituencies as a result of being elected to Parliament. These include householders and 10%ers, among other tools. And finally, a member of this House can simply make a statement to the press, which is what the Honourable Member did in this case to ensure his constituents are aware of his intentions. As well, he penned an op-ed in yesterday's Mont-Royal Gazette to inform voters of the work he is doing on their behalf. I was impressed by the volume of his work, and I'm sure they were too. Mr. Speaker, it may be helpful to draw the Chair's attention to other cases of rumoured by-elections. En 2003, lors de la course au leadership du nouveau Parti démocratique, Jack Layton n'avait pas de siège à la Chambre des communes. Le vendredi 10 janvier 2003, le Toronto Star écrivait que M. Layton n'avait pas écarté la possibilité de la tenue d'élections complémentaires dans Ottawa-Centre. Le problème, Monsieur le Président, est qu'il n'y a pas eu d'élections complémentaires dans Ottawa-Centre. Pourtant, le Toronto Star écrivait que M. Layton n'avait pas écarté la possibilité d'élections complémentaires pour combler ce siège vacant. Le député libéral de l'époque, qui représente Ottawa-Centre, aujourd'hui le sénateur libéral Marc Arbre, n'a jamais soulevé de questions de privilège. Il n'a jamais dit qu'il y avait eu atteinte à ses droits de député, et ce, pour une bonne raison. Il n'y avait pas eu atteinte à ses droits. M. Layton ne faisait que réagir aux rumeurs selon lesquelles le député libéral pourrait bientôt devoir démissionner. Mr. Speaker, I'll draw your attention to a line that appeared in a recent news article from iPolitics with respect to the claims advanced by the Honourable Member for Mont-Royal. It appeared on their online news site on Wednesday, November 16th. Quote, while the member for Mont-Royal, who has an international reputation for his human rights work, has often been rumoured to be on the brink of quitting as an MP, In an interview with iPolitics, the member for Mont-Royal said he has no plans to quit and has not been offered any position or appointments. End quote. Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi de me répéter. L'honorable député a souvent fait l'objet de rumeurs selon lesquelles il était sur le point de quitter ses fonctions de député. I want to repeat that again. The honourable member has, quote, often been rumoured to be on the brink of quitting as a member of Parliament, end quote. So to restate the essentials here, the Conservative Party calls people for the purpose of voter identification. It is an important job, part of the job of any political party, to ask Canadians if they support the party in the event of an election or by-election. The honourable member has often been rumoured to be on the brink of quitting. It is hardly an intolerable leap to insert this in a call script to identify potential voters. Mr. Speaker, this is not a prima facie breach of his privileges or of his collective privileges of this House. It is, in fact, routine political discourse.
That's right.
And for members to find this objectionable is to be shocked to find gambling going on in this establishment. Some members might be stunned by routine political activity conducted by all political parties, or at least the successful ones, but that indignation is no more surprising than Captain Renaud's feigned anger in Rick's Cafe. And I should correct myself, Mr. Speaker. This activity didn't happen in this establishment. It was not done by any body affiliated with Parliament or under your supervision. Mr. Speaker, I would ask you to be cognizant of free and robust dialogue and democratic activities enjoyed in Canada in respect to the election of members, whether it be as a candidate, a partisan, or a voter, when you come to your decision. Monsieur le Président, je vous demanderai de tenir compte des libertés, du dialogue politique et aussi des activités démocratiques du Canada en ce qui a trait à l'élection des députés, qu'il s'agisse des candidats, des partisans ou des électeurs, quand vous rendrez votre décision. À mon avis, le fait de voir une question de privilège prima facie dans ces circonstances jetterait un froid déraisonnable et inacceptable sur le discours politique au pays. Et par conséquent, cela ne devrait être fait que dans des circonstances extraordinaires. Ces circonstances n'existent pas dans le cas présent. To find a prima facie question of privilege in these circumstances would, I suggest, place an unreasonable and unacceptable chill over political discourse in this country, and therefore should only be done in the most extraordinary of circumstances. And those circumstances are not present here. Accordingly, I believe you will agree that this is clearly not a matter for the House, that the House should consider further, given that there was no breach here whatsoever, and that the Chair should rule that there is no basis for prima facie breach of privilege. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I will recognize the honourable member for Mont-Royal on the same point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you will look back to my statement on privilege, Mr. Speaker, and both of them, I said that I had no problem with people engaging in voter identification. I said I understood the practice of outreach. I said I understood that political parties, including ours, had engaged in the issues of voter identification. Right. And the issue is not because of the calls themselves that my work was impeded, calls, voter identification, and the like. It was because in the course of those calls, my work became impeded by the false and misleading information contained in those calls. That is something very different. The voters were not just asked, do you support and would you support the Conservative Party in a general election? I could understand that, even though we had just had a general election 6 months earlier, but let us say in the realm of political discourse, I could understand. Voter outreach being done all the time, that's fine. That was not how it was put, Mr. Speaker. What my constituents were asked is, will you support the Conservative Party in the pending or imminent by-election?
Big difference.
Now, there's a fundamental difference. This is not normal political discourse, as the honourable member said. This is clearly false and misleading information because there was no pending or imminent by-election. And when my constituents replied, what by-election? We don't know of any by-election. They were then told that the member from Mont-Royal has resigned or is about to resign. That clearly comes within the breaches of privilege of sowing confusion in the minds of the voter, and clearly comes within the breach of privilege with respect to prejudicing both my standing with the electorate and not only causing confusion, but impeding my work because of the flood of phone calls and emails, etc., that our office received asking, what about this pending by-election? Or when is this imminent by-election taking place? Or we didn't know that the member for Mont-Royal was stepping down. Or we didn't know that he has already stepped down. That's fundamentally different. The fact that there may have been rumors, Mr. Speaker, after 12 years, I'm still here. In that article that he quoted, I said those rumors have been going on for 12 years, Mr. Speaker. The fact that it emanates very often from the members opposite is something else, Mr. Speaker. And rumors are rumors, I'll just say. People can say rumors. That's fundamentally different again. Fundamentally different of a rumor than to call constituents in a systematic way and specifically targeting those constituents with a view and certainly having the effect of sowing confusion in the minds of the electorate, impeding the member in the performance of his functions, causing prejudice or standing to him within the riding. And, Mr. Speaker, these calls have not abated. And yes, I think it is important that such a practice be ceased and desisted from. I don't think any member of this House should have to be subjected to the kinds of calls. And this is not a matter of party, and that's why I was not saying, although I will say, when that comes, that the former candidate in the riding of Mont-Royal against me, when asked if he was involved with this, said, no, I had nothing to do with this. It was the party. It was the Conservative Party. He identified. Conservative candidate identified the Conservative Party as being involved in this. I believed him when he said he wasn't involved. I equally believe him when he says that the Conservative Party was involved. He identified them. But leaving that aside, Mr. Speaker, the whole point here is that this was not in the course of normal outreach. This was a form of prejudicial misrepresentations of false and misleading information, and, as I say, comes squarely within the criteria. We quoted principle and precedent as to what constitutes a breach of privilege. This is not chilling political discourse for you to rule that it was a breach of privilege. Mr. Speaker, this will chill false and misleading information that tends to corrupt the political process. Sure. Yes, that kind of constraint should be placed so that no member in this House should be subjected to false and misleading information. And again, it wasn't held out as a rumor. It was stated as a fact, a false fact. But it was held out, the member has resigned or is about to resign. There is not a by-election at some point in the future, as I said, let alone a general election. They were talking about a by-election. They said the by-election is pending. The by-election is imminent. There were a series here of ongoing false, misleading, prejudicial misrepresentations, and I think that the Speaker should rule as a question of privilege, not simply for my case, but to protect all members of this House from such false, misleading, as I said, not so much in information, but indeed the kind of innuendo that should find no place in this House or outside of this House in order to prejudicially affect members in this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Here.
I'll recognize the honourable member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have spoken once before on this question of privilege, but after hearing the Conservative member and now the member from the Liberal Party whose motion this is for privilege, finding a privilege, prima facie finding a privilege, I want to draw to your attention the complaint that came from the member from Windsor West with regards to a 10%er, because I think it's exactly on point and fully supports the argument that we just heard. In that case, it was a member from the Conservative Party who had sent a 10%er, which of course is no longer allowed, into the riding of Windsor West, accusing the member from Windsor West of supporting a particular position. I think it was on a crime bill. And Mr. Speaker, in that case, the person who sent it was Monty Sahlberg, who at the time I think was a minister, if not a member, certainly a member of the Conservative Party, sent this 10%er in, claiming that, or accusing, in very very strong language, the member from Windsor West of supporting a particular position. Mr. Speaker, what it was all about was that was a position I had taken as the member from Windsor-Tecumseh. The member from Windsor West had not taken a position on it at all. In fact, I think he was on the other side of the issue at the time. So the material that went into the riding in the form of this 10%er was, again, false and misleading in terms of the position that the member from Windsor West had taken, or maybe had not taken any position at all. And it's exactly the same situation we have here. The allegations that we're hearing, and I think they're confirmed now, I don't think there's much of a dispute over the facts, that in fact the Conservatives, we think, but anyway, the phone calls that were going out were clearly false and misleading as to whether the member was going to be retiring or in some respect leaving his position. That does have, as it did with the member from Windsor West, a negative impact on his ability to perform his function. The same thing happened. All sorts of phone calls into his office, emails, letters, asking about why he had taken this position, when in fact he had not. And that's a direct interference. It's false and misleading, has a negative impact on the ability of the member of Parliament to do their job. And so that file by Speaker Milliken, I think, is exactly on point with the situation we have here. I would urge you to make a decision that, in fact, would find a prima facie case, let us investigate it at PROC, and let us deal with it in an appropriate fashion, as we did in that case. There were repercussions with regards to Mr. Sahlberg in terms of having to apologize, et cetera, et cetera. We need to be doing the same thing in this case. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'll go to l'honorable député de Richmond, Arthavasca.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. En fait, je ne veux pas répéter tous les arguments qui viennent d'être dits par le député précédent ainsi que par le député visé par cette histoire, le député de Mont-Royal. Cependant, je suis extrêmement déçu que le député conservateur qui a défendu la position du Parti conservateur dans ce dossier-là n'ait pas eu la classe de nous dire que c'était une erreur d'agir de cette façon-là. Au lieu de ça, il a justifié l'emploi de cette tactique-là. Et moi, ma conjointe, Monsieur le Président, me dit souvent, quand je fais quelque chose de peu agréable à ses yeux, et c'est très rare, Monsieur le Président, mais elle va souvent me dire, mets-toi à ma place. Alors, je demande ici aux députés, là, tout le monde qui est ici, de tous les partis confondus, particulièrement aux députés conservateurs qui viennent parler et à ses collègues conservateurs, de se mettre à la place du député de Mont-Royal. Alors, tu as des gens qui s'organisent, qui font des téléphones, sondages, pointages, peu importe, dans sa circonscription, et qui disent clairement qu'il va y avoir une élection partielle. Donc, ça veut dire que le député en place est sur le point de s'en aller. Et évidemment qu'il y a atteinte aux privilèges de député, comme je l'ai dit lors d'une première intervention à ce sujet-là, Monsieur le Président, il n'y a pas si longtemps. La personne ou la compagnie ou l'organisme qui veut faire affaire avec son député, qui a un projet en main, se dit, bon, est-ce que ça vaut la peine d'aller voir mon député pour ce projet-là, pour le faire avancer, si bientôt, ce sera peut-être plus lui qui sera là, puisque j'ai entendu parler qu'il allait s'en aller. Alors, vous savez ce que c'est, là? C'est comme une traînée de poudre, là. Les médias s'emparent de ça, la population au complet est persuadée qu'à un moment donné, à cause de quelques appels téléphoniques, le député va s'en aller. Et c'est évident qu'il est atteint dans sa façon de travailler. Il est obligé de répondre à ces questionnements-là dans les médias. Il est obligé de répondre aux commettants. Il va dans les soirées, parce qu'on le fait tous, hein. Les fins de semaine, c'est à ça qu'on passe notre temps, et dans les semaines de relâche, à aller dans des activités. Alors, au club d'âge d'or, je suis convaincu que le député de Mont-Royal se fait dire, est-ce que c'est vrai que vous allez vous en aller? J'ai eu un téléphone. Alors, il passe son temps à réfuter ça, et je pense qu'il devrait passer son temps, évidemment, comme nous tous, à travailler pour faire avancer des dossiers. Et ça, j'ai entendu aucune justification de la part du député conservateur pour nous dire que c'était inacceptable d'agir de cette façon-là. Alors, si on l'accepte pour le député de Mont-Royal, ça va être accepté pour tout le monde. Et si on va partir, là, moi, j'en ai une équipe, hein, qui fait des téléphones, j'ai un paquet de bénévoles, puis on va partir ça, j'ai le ministre de l'Industrie juste à côté dans le comté chez nous. On va dire, le ministre de l'Industrie s'en va, il va travailler, il y a eu une offre pour être ambassadeur. Je ne veux pas le faire, mais je dis juste qu'il ne faut pas qu'on puisse commencer à créer ce genre de précédent-là, Monsieur le Président.
I'll go to the honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest, and then I think it might be time to you have something else to add? The honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, I want to make a couple points. One, the 10% program, householders, falls within the purview of Parliament. Activities by political parties do not. Number two, members seem to be taught to be concerned about tactics that political parties engage in order to ID vote or engage in activities to win votes. Again, I submit that this is of no business to this House. And third, in this case with the honourable member, there is talk and rumor out there that he's put it to rest, and I accept that. But it is not unreasonable in a political discourse to have heard that and to accept that, or for that to be inserted into a script or used to explain why calls are happening. Good, strong political parties are ready for elections at any time, and they'll conduct work throughout the years, in this case 4 years, and not just wait for 4 weeks before the next election. So again, it's important that we separate these activities from the business of Parliament and the business of political dialogue outside of this chamber. That is legitimate and appropriate, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you, sir.
Awesome. Well, I see the honourable member for Humber St. Barbe-Vert has gotten up, so I'll recognize him. But I think it's quickly time to.
Speaker, I think I should respond to the supplementary remarks of my colleague.
Do you have points? I didn't see you getting up. Okay. The honourable member for Humber St. Barbe-Vert.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for recognizing me, and I'm sure you'll recognize the member from Mont-Royal for closing summation comments. I want to be very clear here. The actions that occurred in the electoral district of Mont-Royal are irrefutable. They are vile, they are corrupt, and they are anti-democratic, and they happened. Now, they happened in a way which was very consistent to the previous actions of the Conservative Party of Canada, using House resources to conduct a message targeted, a negative message and a false message targeted at a particular electoral district and a particular member of this House. You know, Mr. Speaker, a professional polling firm, a company, a corporate entity does not do this activity out of their own political philosophy or own personal actions. They do it for remuneration. Someone paid a company to conduct a false poll, a push poll, in the guise of a public relations survey to convey a false message to the electoral district and to the electors within the Mont-Royal district. Mr. Speaker, there has been past activity, precedents, which outline that House resources were used to conduct that activity. That is irrefutable. What is also irrefutable is that this particular survey could just have easily been conducted through one of two means. Through House resources, using the research budgets of the Conservative Party of Canada, or through a subsidy from taxpayers. But bottom line, Mr. Speaker, it is not acceptable to any member that we just simply whistle past the graveyard and sort of ignore this issue. There is a precedent that has been set, there has been rulings that have been set, that if you were simply to find the basis of an investigation to find out the truth, not to whistle past the graveyard, given the fact that there is past activity which supports the notion that House resources were used to do this type of activity, that House resources could now be used to conduct this type of vile activity, not to refer this to committee, not to find a prima facie case, in my opinion, would be an offence to the House. We just simply cannot walk past the graveyard on this. Mr. Speaker, it is incumbent upon us to protect all of us, to protect the rights of individual members. I call on you to do the right thing and allow this matter to be properly vetted. Do not let even the perception or the reality of House resources, of the people's resources, to be used for a false, corrupt message which betrays the true character and integrity of a member of this House. It would be unacceptable.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
You should let the member for Esquimalt Sandwich go first, and then I'd be prepared to.
and skull violence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just rising to make one small point that when I made reference in the first instance on this argument to examples where personal privilege had been found to be violated, they were not limited to the kinds of examples the Honourable Member for New Brunswick Southwest put forward. They were not limited to householders or things within the purview of this House. They included misleading advertising in newspapers, that anything that leads to a confusion about the role of the Member of Parliament in this place is actually against our principles and does constitute a point of personal privilege being breached. I don't want to repeat the argument I made earlier, but just to reinforce that what I've heard from the Honourable Member from New Brunswick Southwest falls short of a satisfactory response to this point of privilege.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Member for Mont-Royal, in addressing the matter that he's concerned about, the suggestions that there would be potentially a by-election in his constituency, has used some very, very strong language to describe these as misleading, wrong, untrue. But when we go back to the original arguments he made, we'll recall that he said people were receiving these calls and they were perplexed. Why am I receiving this call? And they, of course, asked the question, why are you calling me? A reasonable question to ask in the circumstances since he is here. And the response that was given by the callers was, as he said, one that there was a possibility or rumors or suggestions that there would be a by-election. Well, that response that was given was something very interesting. It was the truth. What he is asking you to do here is, while this normal activity is taking place, suppress people from being able to speak the truth. When they're asked, why are you making this call, that there are rumors that there might be a by-election, is the true answer. That's what was prompting the political activity. It's something that he himself acknowledges has been out there, has been present for some 12 years. We're not talking about the past couple of weeks. We're talking about years and years. So clearly, the basis for them answering the truth when asked that question is most reasonable, a reasonable part of speech. And in this case, what you're being asked to do is also extraordinary, in that you're being asked to reach far outside of this House to make a ruling that will affect the freedom of speech and the ability to speak their minds of every single Canadian. Their fundamental charter rights, their fundamental democratic rights, and to say that they aren't able to comment or speculate on whether or not he would be leaving his seat, whether there might be a by-election. Well, if I think about the programs that I watch, the news stories that I read, there are continually items of speculation on whether particular individuals politically in this House might leave early, might retire, might resign. Were you to find favor with the point that the member from Mont-Royal is asking you to make, you would be effectively making that type of speech illegal or outlawed speech that would be affecting the privileges or offending the privileges of every member of Parliament if it ever happened. Kind of putting this special cloak of protection around parliamentarians, insulating them from the normal part of the political and journalistic discourse. Think of the logical outcome were you to find favor with the member from Mont-Royal's suggestions. A political pundit goes on a panel on a TV show and says, well, we've heard, that the member for York Simcoe may want to return to the private sector soon, and it's more lucrative anyhow, and so there's going to be a by-election there in that riding maybe. All of a sudden, that pundit, having speculated on that, is going to be found having offended the privileges of the member, subject to a contempt of Parliament ruling, subject to the fairly extreme potential consequences that are available to the Speaker in that case. That seems to me very unreasonable. The same would apply to any journalist who would engage in that kind of speculation. Entirely normal freedom of speech and expression. The member for Mont-Royal is asking you to suppress that. That's the logical outcome of his decision. There are fundamental rights that exist in a democracy, and I can understand his concern about his privileges being offended. But to say that one cannot speculate on his future, that form of freedom of speech should forever be chilled and suppressed, is to me an overreach that is far too great, that really reflects more his insecurity rather than a confidence in the robustness of our democracy, of our long political traditions. So I'd be very concerned, Mr. Speaker, were you to go down that path with its impact on suppressing democratic activity, suppressing the freedom of speech, not just of political parties, but of every single individual outside this place, and saying to them that somehow we are beyond their ability to speculate or talk about. Because if they say anything negative about our performance, if they say that we might leave, that we have other plans, or that we're not working hard enough, that they are somehow offending our privileges. That's what he said. He said, well, they're saying since I'm leaving, I'm not working hard enough. I'm not doing things for them. Well, guess what? People say that about members of Parliament every single day. Some people say about every single one of us, collectively, that we're not doing that. That should not be found to be a breach of our privileges. That should be part of what it is our challenge every day in this House and outside this House to address as part of a normal democratic discourse. So, Mr. Speaker, I would caution you very strongly against taking the invitation that has been presented to you, chilling that freedom of speech that exists in our society, chilling the democratic discourse, and allowing members of Parliament to somehow be insulated from criticism of their performance, speculation on our jobs by anybody out there. That would be a decision that would be overreaching and unprecedented in my view. When this matter was first raised, I somewhat jokingly said it's quite evident the member is still here. I don't think anybody's disputing that. But I pointed out that Sir John A. Macdonald in his era faced on a regular basis almost every year publication in the Globe by George Brown, who was also a member of the legislature at that time, of story, he was the owner of it and the proprietor, stories that his departure was imminent, which obviously didn't happen for many decades, but that was what he would publish all the time. Sir John A. Macdonald, in the greatest traditions of democracy, understood that was part of normal discourse. We have seen no evidence there were any concerns raised that his privileges were offended. He was willing to go out and address it by doing his job and performing and being part of the democratic process. The fact is this has been going on as long as politics in this country. It is a normal part of politics in this country, and it's not a kind of speech that should begin to be chilled at this point. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We'll allow the honourable member for Mont-Royal to respond, and then I think it's time to move forward to the debate.
Mr. Speaker. I will respond to the two intervenants on the other side. First, some reference was made to 10%ers. Mr. Speaker, your predecessor ruled that there was a prima facie breach of my privileges because of false and misleading 10%ers that were targeting households in my riding, at that time targeting only the Jewish households in my riding. It's part of a pattern, Mr. Speaker. I know they covet the riding. I know they would like to win the riding of Mont-Royal, Mr. Speaker, but you have to do so on the merits. You can't do so by false and misleading and prejudicial information as took place in the 10%ers, which your predecessor ruled as was a prima facie breach of privilege, and with a repetition now with this false and misleading phone calls. Again, Mr. Speaker, this is not a question of rumors of a by-election. We're all subjected to that kind of thing. People in my riding or people in any riding might be asking their member, I heard you might be resigning. I heard you might be going elsewhere or whatever. That's part of sometimes constituents asking a legitimate question to their member of Parliament. But this is not what is being asked here. These are constituents who have been told in false and misleading phone calls by an agency supported by the Conservative Party that there is an imminent by-election and that the member has resigned or is about to resign. I shouldn't have to be back in my riding this weekend, not people coming up to me and saying they heard rumors. That's part of the normal give and take. But coming up and say, I was called and told that you have resigned. I've called and told there's an imminent by-election going on. That's what, under the principles of breaches of privilege, that's what is called sowing confusion in the minds of the electorate. That's what's called impeding the Member of Parliament in the performance of his duties, because I can't speak with my constituents. I can with regard to rumour, but not when they are telling me that they are getting calls making statements of fact, when these are not statements of fact, but they are false and misleading misrepresentations of fact. That's a fundamental difference. This is not a matter of chilling speech. The opposite member elevated this to absolute freedom of speech. Mr. Speaker, if we look at our whole law in this country, our whole constitutional law, there's no such thing as absolute freedom of speech.
Right.
You have laws with respect, limitations on speech with regard to perjury so that people can have a right to a fair trial. You have limitations on false and misleading advertising, Mr. Speaker, directly on point, so that the consumer can be protected against false and misleading advertising. You have laws with respect against obscenity so that people can be protected with respect to their human dignity. I can go through the whole law of free speech, Mr. Speaker. It happens to be something that I happen to have a certain degree of expertise in, having written on it, pleaded it before the Supreme Court and I. This has nothing to do with free speech. This has everything to do with false and misleading and prejudicial information held out in a representation to constituents and held out as if it were a statement of fact, clearly causing prejudice, clearly undermining the role of the member. If the members opposite say, well, they're happy to see that I'm very active and involved. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I am active and involved. That's our responsibilities as members, to be active and involved. But when the constituents believe not only that you're not active and involved, but that you're not even maybe a member anymore, that you have stepped down, that you're about to step down, this transforms the entire relationship between the member and his constituents. Equally, when I was asked this past weekend that they heard that I had stepped down, and I began to tell them about some of the things that I was doing with respect to Bill C-10 in his house, which is somewhat ironic that they're speaking on this today, because, or maybe not so ironic, because we're supposed to enter into a discussion on Bill C-10. It's a nice diversionary approach on their part. But let's leave that aside. The point is that the members of my riding were not aware of the work that I have been doing, and that was precisely what I said in my point of privilege, that it is not only false and misleading, but it overtakes and overshadows and effectively obscures, if not excises, the work that I am doing and the opportunity to engage in what they have called political dialogue. I'd love to be in political dialogue. I don't mind criticism. I don't mind voters coming up and saying, your position on Bill C-10, we totally disagree with it. That's fine. That's fair comment. But that's fundamentally different from a voter coming up to me and saying, how come you're not even involved on Bill C-10? In other words, you're not there. That, Mr. Speaker, is where the prejudice is. The reduction of the Member of Parliament as if he is no longer a functioning Member of Parliament. So that all the work that I've been doing in the last 2 weeks, whether it was getting up in this House, speaking on Bill C-304, Private Members' Bill, on the issue of freedom of speech and hate speech, where I thought the intervention there was important, or that I've undertaken the representation of an Egyptian blogger, a leader in the Tahrir revolution, now being played out in Egypt, who've been imprisoned for allegedly insulting the Egyptian military. A rather dramatically important case. No knowledge of that, my constituents found. When I held a press conference on that case, the questions that I was asked by journalists here is, are you resigning? Have you resigned? Is there a by-election? So it did interfere with my work, interfered in my exchanges with the media, interfered with my exchanges with my constituents, interfered in the public perception of the work in which I was engaged. And so, Mr. Speaker, I just want to conclude by saying that there's no suggestion here that any speech be chilled or suppressed. What is suggested here is that a practice, a misconduct that misrepresents matters that relate directly to the performance of members in their duties here as members of Parliament. To say that it does not address what is being done in this House, it only addresses the capacity of members, and not only me, to perform their duties in this House and as a member of Parliament when outside this House with their constituents, amongst the public, the media and the like. It has a pervasive and persistent prejudicial fallout, impeding, if not prejudicing, the member in their performance of duty. It comes directly within all the principles and precedents that I cited to you in my two statements respecting the request for a prima facie finding of a breach of privilege. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank the honourable member for his further interventions, and I will take all the points made under advisement and come back to the House in due course.